Hey everybody, and welcome to our DJive today. We're going to be taking a look at Coach Ceci's Mindful Business Leadership course and her book, The Leadership Shadow, Transforming Relationships Through Self-Discovery.
Yes, exactly. And it's really all about how understanding what she calls this leadership shadow can help you become a more authentic leader.
Okay, well, that sounds kind of ominous. What exactly is this shadow self? Like, how does it show up at work?
Well, Ceci, she uses this term that was actually coined by Carl Jung, this idea of a shadow self, and she applies it to leadership.
Okay.
She argues that our shadow selves are formed from a whole bunch of different experiences, past professional setbacks or pressures from your industry, maybe even some childhood dynamics.
Oh, wow.
These shape our beliefs and behaviors and often create these blind spots that we don't even realize are there.
Oh, so we're basically carrying around all this baggage that's like impacting how we lead.
Yeah, in a way it is. But the good news is that once we actually become aware of our shadow selves, we can start to manage them. And in her book, Ceci, she uses some really compelling examples to illustrate how this shadow plays out in real life.
Give me an example. Like, how does it show up in a leader's style?
Well, one example that really resonated with me was a story of John, a CEO who would get incredibly defensive anytime he got feedback.
Oh.
And it turns out that he had a really negative experience with some public criticism earlier in his career, and his shadow self was basically just protecting him from feeling that pain again.
Ah, so he's shutting down feedback because of this past experience. Wow, I can see how that would create some tension at work.
Absolutely. And Ceci argues that these shadow behaviors, even if they seem negative, they're often our brain's way of trying to get unmet needs met.
That's interesting. So it's not that John's intentionally trying to stifle his team. He's operating from this place of insecurity.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because Ceci really pushes this idea that understanding these unmet needs is key to transforming our leadership.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How do we even begin to identify these needs in ourselves and in others?
Well, she outlines these 7 basic human needs that are kind of always at play in the workplace. These are things like love and connection, significance and relevance, certainty and control, uncertainty, novelty, growth, contribution, and a meaning in life.
Okay.
And she argues that a lot of our shadow behaviors stem from this desire to get these needs met.
Okay, so if we're feeling insecure or undervalued, our shadow might kick in and lead us to do things like micromanage or be overly critical.
Precisely. It's like our shadow is trying to compensate, but it just ends up creating more problems than it solves.
This is really starting to paint a picture for me.
Yeah.
But I gotta admit, uncovering all these hidden needs and behaviors, it feels kind of daunting. I mean, is this something we can actually manage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that Ceci addresses directly in her work. It's not about getting rid of our shadows. It's about understanding them and figuring out healthier ways to get our needs met. And she provides a whole roadmap for doing just that.
Okay, I want to hear more about that, but before we do, I'm curious about the impact of all this. Like, what happens to leaders who don't address their shadow selves?
Well, imagine a team where the leader's constantly projecting all their insecurities and blind spots onto everyone else.
Right.
You're going to have low engagement, constant conflict, and missed opportunities.
Yeah.
Nobody thrives in that kind of environment.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster. So ignoring our shadow, it not only hurts us, it also affects our whole team and organization.
Exactly. And that's what makes Ceci's work so important. She's giving us a framework to create more conscious, authentic, and effective leadership.
Okay, so we've established that we all have this shadow self that can really create some havoc, and ignoring it is not an option. So how do we actually start integrating this shadow self into our leadership style? Like, where do we begin?
Well, Ceci suggests a few practical steps, and it all starts with self-reflection.
Okay, self-reflection. So we just sit down and think about our thoughts and behaviors.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. She gives us some really specific prompts and exercises to help us dig deep and identify the patterns and triggers behind those shadow behaviors. Like one exercise she recommends is to think about a recent conflict you had at work, something that was difficult.
Okay.
And then ask yourself, what role did my shadow play in this situation?
So step back, be an observer, and notice when the shadow might be taking over.
Exactly. And journaling can be really helpful for that too. It lets you process your emotions and get some insights into that shadow self.
So it's like giving yourself permission to explore those parts of yourself that you might normally try to hide.
Right. And the more we understand our shadows, the less power they have over us.
This is fascinating stuff, and I bet our listeners are dying to hear more about the practical steps they can take to work with their shadows. But let's take a quick pause here and reflect on what we've covered so far. We'll be right back with more from Coach Ceci.
So far we've been talking about the leadership shadow from the book, but Coach Ceci's work goes beyond just identifying the shadow. She gives you actual tools for integrating it into your leadership, and that's where her online course, Mindful Business Leadership, comes in.
This is what I've been waiting for. You mentioned that she gives you like a roadmap for this. I'm really curious to learn more about that.
Think of the course as like a practical companion to the book.
Okay.
It dives deeper into specific strategies and techniques that you can actually use every day as a leader.
So it's more action-oriented. It's got those steps and exercises.
Exactly. And a key element is identifying and addressing those unmet needs that we were talking about earlier. Remember those 7 basic human needs.
Yeah. Love and connection, significance, certainty, uncertainty, growth, contribution, meaning in life.
Right. Well, Ceci developed a framework called the Needs Assessment Matrix.
Okay.
And it's a tool that helps you figure out which of those needs are most prominent for you and how they might be driving your shadow behaviors.
That sounds really useful. Can you walk me through how it works?
Sure. The matrix is basically a series of questions that make you think about your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in different situations.
Okay.
And when you analyze your answers, you start to see patterns emerge. For example, let's say you notice that you always feel stressed out when things are uncertain. This could indicate a strong need for certainty and control.
That makes sense. And once you've identified your dominant needs, what then?
Well, then Ceci guides you through a process for developing strategies to meet those needs in a healthier way. This might involve setting clearer boundaries, communicating your needs more assertively, or maybe even delegating tasks that trigger those shadow behaviors.
So instead of our unmet needs driving us to micromanage or, be super critical, we can actually learn to address them in a way that benefits us and our team.
Exactly. And the beauty of it is it recognizes that everybody's needs are different. What works for one person might not work for someone else.
That's so true. In my experience, I've definitely noticed that some team members really thrive on autonomy and independence, while others really need more structure and guidance. This matrix sounds like it could be a huge help.
It can be really powerful for understanding those differences. And it's not just about understanding your own needs.
Right.
Ceci really emphasizes the importance of understanding your team's needs. The course has modules on things like effective communication, conflict resolution, and building trust.
So it's about making everyone feel supported.
Exactly. And when people feel supported, they're more engaged and more productive. They bring their best selves to work. And that's where Ceci's idea of authentic leadership comes in.
Yes. I was hoping we would get to this. I've heard her talk about authenticity before. How does it tie into the shadow self?
Well, Ceci argues that true authenticity comes from embracing all parts of ourselves, even our shadow sides.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging our imperfections and being willing to show some vulnerability.
That sounds a little risky in the business world.
Well, there's a difference between vulnerability and incompetence. Authentic leadership isn't about airing all your dirty laundry.
Yeah.
It's about being real. It's about admitting when you make a mistake and being open to feedback.
I can see how that could really build trust with your team.
Absolutely. And Ceci gives you specific strategies for cultivating authenticity in your leadership, like practicing active listening, expressing gratitude, and celebrating your team's successes.
It's really not about being perfect. It's about showing up as your whole self, including your shadow.
That's exactly it. And this leads us to one of the most interesting concepts, turning your shadow into a strength.
Now, this is what I'm really curious about. How do we actually take those parts of ourselves that we see as negative and turn them into assets?
It starts with realizing that our shadow behaviors are often just exaggerated strengths. Take someone who's really driven and ambitious. They might also be a workaholic or a perfectionist.
Right.
The trick is finding a way to channel that drive and ambition in a healthy way.
So finding the positive intention behind the negative behavior.
Yes, and that's where this concept of shadow integration comes in.
Okay.
It's about understanding the root of our shadow behaviors, accepting them as part of who we are, and then finding ways to express them in a way that's aligned with our values and goals.
This is really empowering, but I imagine it's not an easy process. How does Ceci help people with this in the course?
She offers different techniques like mindfulness practices, journaling prompts, and guided visualizations. And there's also a whole module on self-compassion, which is super important.
Self-compassion, why is that so important?
Because shadow work can be tough. It asks us to look at parts of ourselves that we might not like, so it's easy to get stuck in self-criticism. But Ceci reminds us that real transformation requires kindness and understanding toward ourselves.
That makes sense. It's hard to change if we're always beating ourselves up.
Exactly. And our shadows aren't the enemy. They're just parts of us that need to be seen. When we approach them with compassion, we can turn them into strengths.
This has been so insightful. I'm starting to see how embracing our shadows can make us better leaders and lead to a more authentic life.
That's the beauty of it. It's about integrating all parts of ourselves, professionally and personally.
This is powerful stuff. I'm sure our listeners are feeling inspired to start their own shadow work. But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear more about how they can actually apply all this. How can they start incorporating Ceci's insights into their work?
Ceci gives a ton of practical tips in the course, but one of the simplest things you can do is start paying attention to your triggers.
Triggers, what do you mean?
A trigger is anything that makes you have a strong emotional reaction. It could be a certain type of feedback, someone's behavior, or even a specific situation. When you start to notice your triggers, you can identify the unmet needs that are driving your shadow.
So the next time I find myself getting defensive in a meeting, I can ask, what's triggering this? And then I can use Ceci's framework to figure out what need might be at play.
Exactly. It's about becoming more conscious of your patterns. And the more you practice this, the better you get at managing your shadow.
It seems like it can lead to more effective communication, better relationships, and a more fulfilling career.
It's not a quick fix. It's an ongoing process, but the rewards are huge.
This has been such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise on Coach Ceci's work. I think this is going to inspire a lot of self-reflection for our listeners.
It's been my pleasure.
We've been talking about how to recognize those triggers.
Yeah.
But how do we actually move beyond that and actually start to shift the behaviors themselves? Is that where this shadow integration comes in?
Yeah, shadow integration is really about, acknowledging those parts of ourselves that maybe we don't like as much and figuring out how we can work with them so they don't, run the show.
Okay. I get that, personal growth and all that. But how does this actually translate to being a better leader? What does it look like when someone's really integrated their shadow?
I think the biggest thing is that they're more self-aware. They understand their strengths. They understand their weaknesses. But they understand, the why behind their behaviors.
So instead of just, I micromanage, it's like I micromanage because I have this fear of failure that comes from this specific thing that happened.
Exactly. And that understanding gives them the ability to choose something different, to address that fear head on instead of just letting it control them.
So you're not pushing the shadow down. You're actually transforming it.
Right.
That's pretty amazing. But is there a risk of overanalyzing things? Do we need to unpack every single reaction?
Well, that's where mindfulness comes in. It's not about overthinking everything. It's about cultivating a sense of presence, a sense of awareness.
So you're noticing the shadow behaviors, but without judging yourself, and then you can decide how you want to respond.
Exactly. And with practice, this starts to feel more natural. You develop this greater capacity for self-regulation, which is so important for any leader.
It sounds like this whole process is about being more intentional and less reactive, right?
That's a great way to put it. And this intentionality also shows up in how we interact with our teams. When we understand our own needs and shadows, we can be more empathetic to the needs and shadows of others.
Yeah, it's like they say, hurt people hurt people. When we're coming from a place of insecurity, we're more likely to project those feelings onto other people. But when we've done the work to heal, we can show up with a lot more compassion.
Exactly. And that creates this ripple effect. When leaders show that they can be authentic and vulnerable, it allows their teams to do the same. It builds trust, which is so essential for innovation and growth.
So integrating our shadows isn't just good for us. It creates a more positive work environment for everyone.
Absolutely. And it builds more resilient organizations. When leaders can acknowledge their own vulnerabilities, they're better equipped to handle uncertainty and change. And that's more important than ever in today's world.
This has been a real eye-opener. I'm already thinking about how I can apply all this to my own work. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners who are, thinking about starting this journey?
I would just say, remember, this is a process. It takes time. So be patient with yourself and celebrate the small wins along the way. And don't be afraid to ask for help. A coach, a mentor, even a trusted colleague can be a huge support.
That's such great advice. We don't have to do this alone. Thank you so much for sharing